So first of all, no. The Tony Awards are not going to be cancelled. However, I was coming on here today to tell you that the Tony Awards had been cancelled, or at least that they weren't going to be broadcast as planned on CBS on June 11th. And yet, I had been putting off making this video because I wanted to see how the situation progressed before I brought you this bad news. And just like we learned in The Prince of Egypt, there can be miracles if you believe. And it looks like the Tony Awards might just be saved after all. However, this will not be the Tony Awards as we know them. It's going to be very different, and in today's video, I'm going to tell you why. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Jo, and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional critic, pundit, content creator, and fan living in the UK, and I talk about all things West End and Broadway here on my YouTube channel. If that sounds like the kind of content that you would be interested in, make sure you subscribe. I have already talked about the Tony Awards. My Tony Awards predictions are coming very soon, now that it looks like the ceremony actually will go ahead again. And at the link in the description of this video, US residents can try and predict the Tony Awards and win a $1,000 TodayTix gift card. Because like I said, the Tony Awards are back on, albeit in a very different format. Before I tell you why it's different, we're going to talk about how we got to here and why the Tony Awards 2023 were nearly cancelled. So over the past few weeks, in the background has been looming the writers' strike. This is not the first time that an American writing guild has gone on strike, and I'm actually going to tell you about another one specifically later in this video. But the current ongoing labour dispute is one between the Writers Guild of America, which represents about 11,500 writers, and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. I'm not going to talk about this at length because it's really not my area of expertise, but as I understand it, the main terms of this are that the WGA would like to be paid fairly. There's an impact on residual payments because of streaming platforms, and they also have concerns about the use of AI technology to replace writers and make them redundant in the writing process. Which honestly feels like a valid concern. Robots are taking over the world and we should all be very concerned about it. But that's neither here nor there when it comes to talking about the Tony Awards. So what's kind of surprising, and yet really not if you know anything about the bureaucracy of theatre and the people who run it, is that even though this writer's strike was imminent and everyone was aware of it, even when I was going live on YouTube reacting to the Tony nominations, people were in the comments saying Tonys might not even happen because of the writer's strike. Like, we knew this was coming, but it's been reported that there was no discussion between like the Broadway League and the WGA prior to any of this. Like, even though this was looming, this was not discussed and this was not negotiated in advance, which probably in hindsight would have been a good idea. Now, I hear you ask, what does the Writers Guild of America and their strike action have to do with the Tony Awards? The Tony Awards are all about celebrating Broadway and American theatre. What does that have to do with TV writers? Well, the TV broadcast of the Tony Awards is still hugely dependent on a group of writers, and everything that is planned in advance to be said at the awards, i.e. what the presenters say, what the host will say, but not what the people giving speeches will say, is largely compiled by WGA members. This creates a problem because the WGA members are on strike, and to try and replace them with someone else would constitute a crossing of a picket line. Other writing unions have been instructed not to take work that would originally have been WGA contracts. So this puts the Tony Awards in something of a pickle. And the skeptics among you might wonder why this matters, because we need to be supporting the writers and we need to be supporting the unions, and I believe very strongly in both of those things. The writers should absolutely be advocated for. They should be paid fairly. It would represent a small drop in the ocean for the studios to pay these writers fairly. In fact, it would cost less than what they've already lost due to the strike action. So their ongoing refusal starts to look a lot like stubbornness and not good business sense. Additionally, I'm all about supporting a union at any time, but the Tony Awards are so important to Broadway. How important? Well, it's not just that nominations help a show stay open, and wins definitely help a show stay open, because a lot of people who might sit on the fence about booking at very high ticket prices would decide to go and book something if it wins Best Musical. That's going to be a huge injection of ticket sales, by which I mean money, into a show. A show like Kimberly Akimbo that opened a decent while before the Tonys and has had to sustain itself not on celebrity casting names, not on a hugely well-known title or a particularly commercial concept, is really waiting for that kind of awards buzz, and it's won various awards for its off-Broadway run, but it really needs that Tony. One huge indicator of how important Tony Award nominations can be to the lifespan of a show is the fact that Bad Cinderella and Dancing both announced closure shortly after they were announced to be receiving 0 Tony Award nominations. But it's not just that. The Tony Awards are watched by people nationwide, perhaps even worldwide. And there is little better advertising that exists for Broadway shows than their opportunity to perform. These performances are so carefully planned and thought out because they are huge marketing opportunities. Something like a Shucked, when it gets to perform on the Tony Awards, is going to reach so many more people who would not have known about this show and is going to convince them that it looks super fun and they're going to buy tickets. So even if the Tony Awards had been allowed to still occur through the writer's strike but not been televised, this still would have been a huge loss to the Broadway community. A community and an industry that we ought to remember is still very much struggling post-pandemic and still in the process of resurgence. Now, this all came to a head a few days ago when it was announced that the Tony Awards had asked for a waiver, had asked to be allowed to continue despite the writers' strike, for an exception to be made. And this was refused, which is why I do think it would have been a fantastic idea if they'd had some kind of communication prior to the start of the strike and prior to all of this going down, especially because we knew that this was coming. But in any case, the news broke that the Tony Awards would not be broadcast on June 11th. So in response to this, here is what was said at the time. The Tony Awards Management Committee has set an emergency meeting for Monday. I'm talking to you on Tuesday, so that was yesterday, to determine the best path forward between the two available options. The first being to keep the June date and invite nominees and media to a dinner or press conference, non-televised, which would lose the marketing opportunities for all the shows to perform. And the alternatives include postponing the show until the strike concludes and picking back up when the awards can be televised. I have subsequently heard that that was never really on the table. The powers that be did not want postponement to even be considered. We have gone through this before. We had the 2020 Tony Awards, the year that wasn't, and I think there's a general feeling within the theatre industry that everyone wants to feel like we are back to normal. Broadway wants to be back and better and stronger than ever. At this time, the wonderful Kate Shindle, who happens to be president of Actors Equity Association at this time and was also an original cast member of Legally Blonde and was also Miss America once upon a time, like no one else on earth has this woman's resume. She's incredible. She said, "I hope that anyone and everyone who is concerned about Broadway's biggest night of the year will pledge support for the WGA and join us in demanding that the AMPTP give their workers as much consideration as they devote to executives and shareholders." An excellent point. What we really don't want to happen in the midst of all of this is for the anger and the frustration of a potentially cancelled Tony Awards to be misdirected at the striking WGA union. They have every right to strike and we should be supporting them, and we should be mindful of the fact that the real problem here is being caused by the AMPTP. So that was where we were up to by the weekend. Cue Monday and this emergency meeting. And as a result of some concessions that are reportedly being made by the organisers of the Tony Awards, they will now be televised as originally planned on June 11th. However, it's going to be a very different Tony Awards because of the writers' strike. So let me tell you everything we know right now about what these Tony Awards are going to be like. I'm reading from the New York Times right now, who have reported that the Tony Awards will proceed as scheduled in an altered form after the Writers' Union said Monday night that it would not picket the show. So the WGA aren't going to picket the Tony Awards, which means that the actors and the creatives and the participants won't have to cross the picket line in order to participate. This is a very big deal. It's not just about the logistics of like walking through a picket line. It is about what that represents. They go on to make a very excellent point that Broadway is a heavily unionised industry, and unionised theatre workers like actors and musicians were not going to participate in an awards ceremony being protested by another labour union. They would have very likely showed solidarity. However, I do think now that this has been allowed to happen and the WGA have granted some sort of a leniency here, that actors and musicians are going to participate because they know how important this is to their shows and to their Broadway community. As they have stood by us, we stand with our fellow workers on Broadway who are impacted by our strike, the Writers Guild of America said in a statement late Monday, which is hugely appreciated, and it's a tremendous, incredible gesture by the Writers Guild of America, who don't owe this to anyone amidst their own strike action, but who are behaving with an enormous amount of grace in allowing this to happen. This is basically them appreciating and acknowledging how much a cancelled Tony Awards broadcast would negatively affect Broadway, and not just shows closing, but the unemployment of all of those people working on those shows. Not just casts, but the crew, the backstage, the front of house team. Like, there are so many people who will be negatively affected by the lost ticket revenue as a result of a cancelled Tony Awards broadcast. This is very far-reaching. And the New York Times says exactly that. They say a disruption could have been damaging to Broadway, which sees the televised ceremony as a key marketing opportunity, particularly now when audiences have yet to return to pre-pandemic levels, which is more or less what I've been saying before. Several nominated shows have been operating at a loss, holding on in the hopes that a Tony win or even exposure on the broadcast could boost sales. This is exactly what we've been saying about why this matters so much. The union made it clear that the broadcast, which is scheduled to air on CBS on June 11th, would be different from past ceremonies. So the Tony Awards Productions, which is a joint venture of the Broadway League and the American Theatre Wing, who you hear everyone thanking in their speeches, has communicated that they are altering this year's show to conform with specific requests from the WGA, and therefore the WGA will not be picketing the show. They have not yet clarified what these requests were and what the differences are going to be, but we can read between the lines a little bit here. I will add another part of this statement from the union which makes it very clear. They say responsibility for having to make changes to the format of the 2023 Tony Awards rests squarely on the shoulders of Paramount/CBS and their allies. They continue to refuse to negotiate a fair contract for the writers represented by the WGA. They are reminding you there whose fault this entire mess is. It's not the writers. Now, while the Tony Awards administrators haven't officially passed comment at the time of me filming this video, it says here, a person familiar with the plan who was granted anonymity to speak about conditions that are not yet public said the revised broadcast would include the presentation of key awards and live performances of songs from Broadway shows, but that it would not feature any scripted material by screenwriters in its opening number or comedic patter. This means there will not be an opening monologue as such, there will not be skits. And from what I can tell, when presenters are presenting awards, they will not have a script to read from, which is already making me sweat just a little bit, because these celebrities at the Tony Awards struggle enough when it's scripted and when it's on a teleprompter in front of them. Like, I'm already having traumatizing flashbacks to Brooke Shields trying to participate in an opening number and having the one line she needed to say on a teleprompter in front of her and not being able to get it right. I just have concerns that whatever this is going to be a little bit of a mess. But it's happening, it's being allowed to go on, and that's the most important thing here. The Tony Awards agreed that they would not use any part of a draft script that had been written before the screenwriters' strike began, so obviously they had some plans already in place, but they are not even allowed to use that, because that would still be them using the work of a striking labour union. They have to disregard that entirely. And the New York Times goes on to report that it's very unclear what kind of a role Ariana DeBose, who was due to host this year's ceremony, is going to play. Is she still going to be able to do an opening number? I mean, the people who normally write the opening numbers for the Tonys aren't members of the Writers Guild of America, from my understanding. I could be wrong about that. But normally these are musical theatre composers, who I would have assumed fall under a slightly different remit. So like I said, there are so many question marks around what exactly the Tony Awards are going to look like this year. However, this has happened before. Back in 1988, the Tony Awards took place and were broadcast amidst a writer's strike. And that year, similarly, they went on unscripted, and host Angela Lansbury and the presenters spoke from the heart and shared anecdotes about their experience of performing on stage and discovering their love for the stage. Fun fact, 1988 was the year that Into the Woods lost out to Best Musical to The Phantom of the Opera, two shows that have definitely been talked about an awful lot for different reasons this year as well. So we are just going to have to wait to find out a little bit more about what these Tony Awards are going to be. Hopefully we will get more information on this prior to June 11th, but at the very least, I feel like those of you who are planning Tony Awards watch parties are going to have to add a chaotic new category to your Tony Awards bingo/drinking games. References to the writer's strike and presenters getting completely lost in the silence of their unscripted banter. I'm so intrigued, I'm a little bit concerned, but I'm mostly just relieved that the Tony Awards are going to be broadcast. They are so important for Broadway, and selfishly, they are one of my favourite nights of the year as well. Solidarity with the WGA. I hope they get everything that they are asking for from the AMPTP. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have enjoyed. I will bring you more updates about this as we get them. If it's just a little piece of news, then I'll probably post it on my other socials channels, so make sure you're following me on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, at MickeyJoTheatre. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!